Hey, my name is Andreas Stuber, and this is about Nemisis, a software to fight asymmetrical injustice in the case of sexual harassment or corruption, for example. Nemesis is the name of the Greek goddess of just revenge or justice, and I'll show you how this goddess can help you fight injustice. The typical use case of of Nemesis is in the case of asymmetrical injustice, which means that the perpetrator, for example, a man, a state, a religious person, a manager, a company, so somebody or an entity or a person in the in a role that has a lot of power, commits an act of injustice against a victim that is much less powerful. For example, an individual, a woman, a child, who typically in cases of sexual harassment or other face the issue that they have to report something to a police or some other department that might be already corrupt or bribable or something like that in its own right. And then they would have to publicize their own identity and go publicly against this other person or organization, be threatened by libel laws, etc., etc. So this asymmetrical situation is something that Nemesis intends to address, and I'll show you how. So the basic idea is the following: is we are going to do the same thing as weaker animals are doing against powerful animals. So for example, if you watch birds, if you have a predator like a hawk hunting after a swarm of birds, the birds collectively swarm together, which means that the hawk is no longer able to identify one individual bird. So the individual bird gets camouflaged in the swarm. And the same thing happens with fish. If you have a shark or another predator, the fish typically come together, and then the shark is no longer able to distinguish or follow one particular fish. And the idea is to do exactly the same thing with software. So if you want to report a crime, you would have some degree of camouflage, which would allow you to make a legal statement in some sort, but keeping your identity hidden until a certain moment when you are sure there are other victims as well. And if you know that there are sufficiently other victims, let's say if you have 20 other people that are threatened or have been harassed by this same perpetrator, then you can decide to join forces and launch a counterattack against that perpetrator or organization or whatever. It also means that if many people report injustice cases against certain institutions or persons, we will have a much better visibility on where crimes are committed. Even if we would not want to disclose details about the predator or about the victims, it would give us a much better granular level of visibility on which kind of crimes are committed. Currently, this is done at a very analytical level by organizations such as Transparency International or others, but it's actually tendentially, especially in those cases of asymmetrical injustice or rape cases, for example, extremely difficult to have proper figures. And in some cases, they are very implausible. For example, if you look at rape or sexual harassment statistics, the country on earth that has most cases of reported sexual harassments is Sweden, for example. Well, I would have picked another country, right, intuitively, but it might be that they're all sexual predators, or Switzerland as well, I don't know. But it probably just means that there is a very large dark figure of unreported cases. We have no visibility, really no visibility on how serious which crime is. So basically the idea is to allow you to report something and camouflage you at the same time. Now, the first thing is, in order to be credible, it is important that the software is able to identify you. If I say you, it means a victim or an individual or organization that wants to fight injustice, right? So it is important that you are able to identify yourself by as many ways as possible. For example, it could be your mobile phone number, Facebook ID, LinkedIn ID, Google Plus ID, passport picture, national ID, or it could be a company email ID, or it could be a company that wants to participate in the Nemisis program, and they would share Active Directory organizational structures with us so that we would know that this person is part of that company and so on. The reason why this is important is, and again, this identity and all those properties, like which company you are from, which location you are from, which sex, and so on, all this information is only available to you, encrypted, locked down, nobody has access to it, in any case, in any stage of the whole process. And I'll show you how software will lock down this thing. But the object to which only you have access to will verify that you are an actual person as much as possible. And the more identification means you provide, the more credible will be your statements. So if we have multiple identifiers of yourself, LinkedIn profile could be, it will mean, okay, this is actually a real human being, and we have several links, and we have seen that there is a long Facebook history, there is a long Twitter history, there is an actual email ID, and so on. So we have various means that make you credible as a human being. Now, this information is locked into a software object, encrypted, and in such a way that only you have access to it. The only thing that is visible to external world is there is an object and it has a certain degree of credibility. That's it, right? That's the only thing that is being changed, that is being shared under certain circumstances. Now, once you have such an object, you are able to report cases of injustice. So you can say, I have been harassed by person XYZ, and then identify that person by LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, again, phone number, mobile phone number, whatever, name, address, and so on, whatever information you might have about the perpetrator. It could also be a company, could be a URL of a company, could be any profile that you might have of that. Or it could be, it has been a police officer of the police department of the city of Bern in Switzerland, for example. That would also be a valuable piece of information. I mean, be as precise as possible. Then you would add information such as geotags, geolocation tags to know where was the crime committed. Timestamps are always useful, and so on. So you will report crimes of whatever nature and sort they are, so, and against with whom that was committed. Could also be that if you have bribed the police officers, in some countries that happens, you could say, today I was pulled out of traffic unjustly by a police officer and I paid him a bribe of $5 in order to allow me to continue. So it could be that you are actually the perpetrator, legally speaking, you bribed the police officer, but you still report that case of bribing. So it's not exclusively only victims in a legal sense. It could also be that you are actually a perpetrator, or you are the secretary of a company that bribed another company to win an award contract and so on. So the more what the system will do, it will take together similar sounding statements involving the same entities being individuals or companies. And if several people reported the same crime, this crime becomes highly credible. So there will be a notion of scoring of crimes and giving each crime credibility, which will be a function of the credibility of the individual entities that will report the crime along with details on the crime committed. So the software will be able to validate crimes, or validate in a sense, did they really exist or not. That the more people from different roles reported on the same crime, the more credible it is. And then it goes on to the more, now if the software sees that, say, 20 people reported that this individual or this organization committed a certain type of crime, let's take a rape case, for example, Weinstein, for example, you could then do the following. You could allow the victims that interacted in some way with the perpetrator to communicate securely together. So it could enable those victims of that perpetrator to act together and say, hey, we are actually 30 victims of Weinstein. Let's join forces and fight him, because I'm no longer alone. I'm part of a swarm and I can launch a counterattack, right? So you basically turn around the roles, and the software will ensure your privacy at any moment in case. So for example, it would publish information that is anonymous. So we could say there are 30 reported cases against this or that institution or that victim or that perpetrator. But it would not do it if a certain camouflage number to be defined is not reached. So if there is only one person that reports a certain case, that would not be published. If there are 30, or I think a good number, let's say statistically speaking, over 30 it would be a no-brainer, right? You could then say between 5 and 30, you would have a moment where you can say there has been a crime committed with that organization or entity or person. And then you would just say something happened, but you don't say who was the counter person. So there's always a notion of when do you start publishing information, and the victims or the testimonials, testifiers, I forgot the English words, die Zeugen in German, they can always choose to make statements or to come a little bit out of the shadows or not. They can always choose to which extent do they want to expose themselves, as well as their statement. Could also be that you have a reported crime case for which the police is looking for example, for which the police is looking for testimony. So they could say to or they could send a message to potential victims of a certain organization or person and say, hey, we are looking for testimonies for this particular entity. Has anybody seen similar crimes or cases and so on? And we would like you to come forward. We have a victim, a witness protection program, etc., etc. So there is a way also to communicate between legal authorities, state attorneys, for example, you could crown that they would be able to securely transfer a message to potential victims and witnesses, and they could then communicate back securely and anonymously. And at some point, when it comes to a legal case in front of court, they can maybe, if they are properly protected, come out of their anonymity and make their statements public. Who pays? So the idea is that potentially damaged institutions pay. You all know that, or I don't know if you all know, but it's common knowledge that, for example, the development funds that are being spent on Africa are larger than typical bribes back and forth to Africa, right? So there's a huge amount of money wasted, and the institutions that are mainly damaged by this are organizations in Africa or citizens of Africa, so the state of Africa. So we could have those institutions that are damaged or that support potentially damaged institutions such as development funds, NGOs, the World Bank, World Economic Forum, and so on. They could pay Nemisis to extract information about where was how much crime committed. So you could, for example, let's say you are at World Economic, or you are an NGO, you are investing funds into a development program, and you want to make absolutely sure that your funds are well invested. There is no, how do you say, graft or anything. Money is really going where it should go. There is no money spent on things you don't want it to be spent on. So you could ask all your employees to install Nemisis, which means that anybody that observes improper usage of your funds or improper behavior could report it anonymously without having to fear any retribution from a local manager that might be corrupt. And which means that if you fund an organization in which you have improper handling, you would be notified that there is some degree of improper handling of your funds. And then you might not know exactly where, because we will still camouflage. That needs to be detailed a little bit. I have it clearly in my head, but I would need some time to write it up. You could then know in which organization or in which department, in some cases, which individual there was how much corruption and how much wastage there was. And you would then receive camouflaged statements. For example, there were 15 reported cases with 18 independent statements of sexual abuse by Catholic Church in Bern, Switzerland in 2017, for example. Or there were 260, you can see the statements down here, right? So there are a certain degree of statements that will still leave the victims anonymous. So you have credible statements that have been made where the victims or witnesses might not want to come forward and identify themselves for whatever reason, because they typically fear for reprisals. And then the states could then say, okay, we will make some witness protection programs or whatever. So these would be the typical payers. What could also be possible investor for this would be any peer-to-peer blockchain investor in emerging market, or that wants to go into emerging markets, because I think emerging markets have the biggest potential for blockchain technologies, which typically allow certain business transactions such as microfinance, micro insurance, micro sharing, micro whatever. The biggest potential for those is actually in emerging markets, not so much in developed markets where we have all of this already available. And if we use typical disadvantage of Africa, which is corruption, to our advantage, it might actually be that this whole new technology of blockchain and Ethereum and so on is actually becoming a strength for this. So how would the application look like for the end user? So we have your woman or a citizen or a victim or an employee. You would have a mobile application, and then you can say, okay, I have suffered a crime by this or that person. You identify it by LinkedIn, email, whatever profile, share it, Facebook, whatever, or company or whatever. You identify your role, who was this or what was the counterpart of the crime, what kind of crime was committed. So there would be a thesaurus of crimes in the application, and you could possibly also select the damage. So the damage could be a financial damage. It could be either the amount of the bribe or the amount of the potential damage to the institution that was damaged, or it could be a physical or an emotional damage, which is not something that could be financially classified, or at least, I mean, there are models how to do that, but it's less easy. And the result of all of this would be that you would have much preciser statements for companies or for states or for NGOs to know where, how much of which crime was committed and what was the absolute loss. Company boards could then, for example, say, okay, we want to contact those witnesses, we put them under a protection program, or we want to have management objective for the directors of the company, where we say that if your corruption or bribes in your companies trespass this or that amount, then your bonus will go down so and so much, whatever. I mean, you can take whatever measure as a shareholder to, you can use Nemisis as a shareholder to fight corruptions in your own company. As I said, the witness can always choose how much he or she wants to camouflage, and they can join forces to fight against the perpetrator. The technology that I think is most suitable for this is blockchain. Blockchain is a distributed secure database. You might have heard of Bitcoin, the digital currency for online. Yeah, it's a digital currency, which is not like dollars or Swiss francs or British pounds. It's an online currency. And on top, but actually it's nothing else than a distributed ledger and distributed secure encrypted database, which is unviolable and so on. There's lots of videos on this if you're interested in this. And on top of this, we would use a layer for computation, which is Ethereum, and we would then program the business or the logic of those crime cases into Ethereum. And in Ethereum, we would then say things such as nobody can read the content of any object except the whistleblower himself, or nobody can read a statement unless there are certain conditions that are matched. It could also say a certain amount of objects or statement or witnesses together can make a statement as long as they are the number of objects is sufficiently large so that they remain anonymous. And then you can also enable that certain objects like states or whatever are able to contact individuals if they have witness protection programs and stuff like that. Again, it requires a lot of technical objects in the background. I have thought it through in some detail. I think all of it is possible, but it needs to be thought through properly. Funding for this, I think funding at the beginning is difficult, but I think in the long run it might actually fund itself. So first thing is it should be free for anybody who wants to report, right? So anybody should be able to use the mobile application and say, I have suffered some crime or whatever. Anybody who wants to retrieve information, and again, for witnesses, it will also be free to have joint actions against perpetrators. Now, anybody who wants to retrieve aggregated anonymous information, so for example, I want to know to what extent was my company ExpertFlow, for example, bribed, or how much bribes did we pay, I would have to pay Nemisis a certain amount in the virtual currency Ether. Ether is the currency used by the Ethereum network. It's a little bit an alternative to Bitcoin, with the difference that it's actually able to use the notion of contracts and business logic behind it. And those funds that we would able to get from the people that want to extract this information would then be used to fund, run, and improve the platform. We could then also have the notion of tokens, so you could, or ownership shares, where you could say certain organizations or individuals can purchase ownership. It would actually be something like a foundation, where if you have purchased a certain amount, or either contributed or purchased the right to retrieve information, you actually have also a stake in governing the Nemisis Foundation, if this is going to be a foundation, right? My suggestion would be that it's a non-profit foundation, not a for-profit corporation, although I see good business potential behind it, because you would be able to publish very relevant business data as well, at least in the corruption environment, not so much in the case of sexual violence, right? So as a target market, I would tendentially pick emerging markets. I mean, if you look at this map, this is fantastic, right? I mean, from ExpertFlow's perspective, this is a slide showing corruption worldwide by Transparency International, which is an organization that I respect very much. It's exactly the markets that we as ExpertFlow address, right? So we are in the middle of this fantastic market, which is hugely corrupt, and actually there would be a lot of improvement potential by fighting corruption. So that's one. Secondly, several studies show that P2P, peer-to-peer blockchain technology have the largest potential in emerging markets, such as microfinance, microinsurance, micropayments, which is an overlap with what we do as well. ExpertFlow is the company that I am running. I don't yet know whether and in what form we would participate. might be kind of useful because we have certain assets that might be useful for Nemisis as well, could be completely separate as well. And I want to kind of keep it separate, but there might be some sort of interesting exchange. So what ExpertFlow has is we have offices in 5 different locations across Africa and the Middle East. We have 83 software engineers, and we can very rapidly ramp up software engineering capacity. If we make a job advertisement, we get 500 job applications within 24 hours. So it's easy for us to attract and hire good talent rapidly. And this is talent that has experience or is suffering corruption, right? So they know what they are fighting against. ExpertFlow is primarily addressing B2B2C, so customers. So we are deploying customer care solutions for banks, service providers, utilities, and state authorities. In some cases, we have been asked by state authorities to help them fight corruption already. And this whole Nemisis thing actually came out by 2 or 3 projects where we were asked to install a call center where citizens would be able to report corruption cases. And then I thought a little bit further because I wasn't convinced that call center is the best way to address this. It's a little bit against the interest of ExpertFlow to say something like that. But I think Nemisis would be way more powerful in this. And lastly, I think ExpertFlow is probably an interesting company to work with for that, because we are based out of Switzerland, just like the Ethereum Foundation. And I think Ethereum is the best technology for tackling this. I mean, it's an open source technology, and it has a pretty vibrant network exchange within Switzerland, as far as I know. Now, how can you help? Right now, this is only a hobby of mine. Those of you that know me, I come up with ideas like this every 2 months or that. I get all excited. And until now, I usually wasted company money on this. And then we kind of see, oh, maybe it was not such a good idea, and so on. So I don't want to do that any longer, right? So if we do something with ExpertFlow, it should be something that we're quite sure is something realistic and so on. So what I would need from you is some sort of a reality check, right? Because I'm all excited about this, but I don't want this to, how do you say, impact in any way or sort ExpertFlow. So I'm only working on this over the weekend, hence I'm publishing this video on the weekend as well. If you think the ideas in this video are kind of convincing or could be developed, like the video, comment on it, discuss with me, meet me in Bern or here in Switzerland. And if you want to go further, so just to validate the idea, that would be important, because I'm always getting excited, and then it's difficult for me to discern between what is a real opportunity and what is just up in the skies idea that is not really real or realistic, let's put it that way. If you do think it's realistic, the best thing if you would be able to fund it. So if you could say, this is a fantastic idea, I want to fund it with $100,000 or up to $100,000, whatever. And then we could take this idea a little bit forward. I'll show you in the next slide how. That would be almost the most important element to take it forward seriously, because otherwise it will just remain a hobby of mine. Might be the interesting discussions, we might be validating it, but it will just go on very slowly, if at all. And then we would obviously have to, I would be looking for interesting exchange with people that could help me with marketing, documentation, programming, justice, transparency international, interest in blockchain, Ethereum, or whatever other technologies there might be. So the next steps is I'm looking for funding. One thing also is, so there would be some sort of, we would probably create some sort of a foundation, still to be defined. I think we could probably go a very far way with $300,000 to $500,000. Now the point is that there is probably, I would say, a 50% chance that we would stop before we get to those 3 to 6 months, because we see for whatever reason that it's not realistic, not feasible, legally not feasible, technical problems, whatever. So at the beginning, I would want to sort out any killer criteria in this. I have given it some thought, but at the beginning I would just want to weed out any complete killer criteria. So at the probability of the whole thing stopping after a very short amount of time is very large, and then the longer we go ahead, the lower the probability would be that we stop. Looking at the technology and available tools, I have the impression that we could probably have a prototype with a mobile user interface available in about 3 to 6 months. It doesn't look exceedingly complicated. I think the complicated part here is actually the business logic to be implemented, so it would be more legal considerations and who reports when to whom, stuff like that. As that is moving ahead, I would like to have some partnership discussions with corporations, NGOs, and so on. And then once that is done, start doing sales discussions with corporations that are operating in markets that are highly corrupt, to which I have many contacts, right? Because we are working in this sector already. So that might be a later step afterwards. Voila, I think that's, yeah. So, and for funding, it could be individuals because you just want to make this world a better world and you want to protect children from child abuse, you want to protect women from rape and violence and so on. So that would be fantastic. Or you could say, no, I'm a hard-nosed business investor, I'm a business angel or whatever, and I want to make money out of this. Both scenarios would work, right? So we would have to then find how we want to do this. Once we have this going, as I said, the long-term financing would be from the entities that I'm showing here. So it could be companies that want to register with Nemisis. So let's say ExpertFlow wants to say, we are against corruption. All of our employees are on Nemisis. So if they bribe or are bribed, or if they're witness of bribes, they can actually report this using Nemisis. And so if multiple companies are using Nemisis, the companies know that anybody can report on corruption without fearing retribution, and knowing that there are so many potential witnesses that can report will actually decrease the probability of crimes, because the probability of being discovered becomes much higher, right? So it could be funding by risk insurance companies, shareholders, rating companies, anybody that wants to have some business reporting or has some stake in anything. World Economic Forum, development funds, they can use Nemisis to know whether their funds are properly invested. Victims can fund Nemisis for class action, transparency could use it, etc. Voila, that's it. Thank you very much for your interest, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments, and have a good weekend.